Hello and thank you for joining in on today's training. Heart & Solutions is a proud provider of CE-eligible trainings for our counseling community. This training may be eligible for continuing education credit hours through either the National Board for Certified Counselors, provider number 7376, or the Association of Play Therapy, provider number 21-645. To obtain CE hours for today's training, be sure to follow the steps in the description below to find and take your quiz.
You guys are in for quite the wonderful training today, but we are really happy to introduce yet another live webinar hosted by You Need a Training, and we are very excited today to be able to talk about the neuroscience of compassion fatigue and how to address it. And here to share all of her wisdom with us is Natasha D'Arcangelo. And just so you guys can learn a little bit about Natasha and some of the incredible things that she is bringing to this training today. Natasha is a licensed mental health counselor in the states of Florida, Oregon, and Washington. She's a Florida qualified supervisor, a nationally certified counselor, a certified clinical trauma professional, a certified compassion fatigue professional, a compassion fatigue educator, and a certified forward-facing professional resilience coach and consultant. She received her Master of Arts in Clinical Mental Health Counseling from Ergassi University, Sarasota. She is the clinical director of Lakewood Residential Treatment Center and the owner of D'Arcangelo Counseling and Consulting, LLC. Her previous experience includes 15 years as an educator in inpatient psychiatric setting, community mental health, private practice, and mental health tech. She is an international speaker that has presented on various topics, including destigmatizing mental health care, compassion fatigue, and effective techniques for working with teens. She operates from a cultural humility perspective and is an ally of the LGBTQIA+ community. She is especially passionate about working with clients who are struggling with trauma and anxiety. So we are, like I said, really fortunate to be able to present to you today information about compassion fatigue. And so as we go through today's training, you are going to be able to gain new insight and skills on how to manage your clinical practice in more sustainable ways. So Natasha will be addressing impacts of working through the pandemic, specific issues that impact BIPOC clinicians, and provide evidence-based techniques clinicians can immediately implement to improve their quality of life. As I said, we do have a small group with us live today, and fortunate for you, this is a very interactive workshop today, so please, I'm sure Natasha will give some instructions as well, but please be ready to participate today. She'll give some specific instructions about holding questions until the end. You're welcome to place those in the chat if you don't want to lose track of the questions you do have. But to help us stay on track and move through things today, we'll save additional questions for the end. But as I mentioned, please interact throughout this workshop today. And I will let Natasha take over.
All right, before I start sharing my slides, hi everybody. It's nice to have a smaller group because hopefully that means we'll have good conversations between us. Otherwise, it's just 2 hours of me prattling on, and nobody wants that. So a couple of disclosures. I am at work today. I told them to only come and get me if the building is on fire. So we shall see. But you will need pen and paper handy because there will be multiple points throughout where I'm going to ask you to write something down or process through something or, kind of get your thoughts down. So it is very helpful to have pen and paper handy, just FYI. And I do get easily sidetracked by questions, which is why I ask that you hold them until the end, because I will go off on a tangent and I won't necessarily reel myself back in on time. So disclosure there as well. Very excited to be here today. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen. Thank you so much for the introduction, Colleen. I appreciate that. There it is. Same thing. we'll skip over that. So we have quite an ambitious agenda ahead of us, but I'm hopeful that we'll be able to accomplish all of these things. We're going to go ahead and start with a definition of compassion fatigue. I do want to talk about the impacts of COVID, as it is still very much alive, and it is still very much impacting the work that we do. We're going to go through some symptoms of compassion fatigue. We'll talk about how you can do your own self-assessment. And then finally, we are going to develop a self-care plan. So before I head into the definition of compassion fatigue, I want to address some things that are not in my bio, and we're starting already with the interactive part of the presentation. So I never make it a part of the slides, but one thing that I think it is incredibly important for everybody to think about is your own intersectional identities. So I'm going to go through mine and I'm going to share mine. As I'm doing that, I want you to think about what your own intersectional identities are, and go ahead and get those down on a piece of paper, because those things walk into a room with you when you're doing your therapy sessions, whether that's a virtual room or whether that's a physical room where you're seeing the clients that you work with. So for myself, I am cisgender. I do use she, her pronouns, identify as female. I am heterosexual. I am brown. I navigate the world as a brown person. It's pretty obvious when I walk out my front door. I can't really hide this. I am first generation American, and being the child of immigrant parents has very much influenced my worldview, especially my work ethic and what my definition of being American is. I was raised solidly middle class, which puts me in a privileged position with many of the clients that I work with. They weren't necessarily raised in that same socioeconomic bracket. And I would also like to give a land acknowledgement. I'm in Central Florida. The research that I've done has led me to see that I live on land that belonged to the Seminole people. So I want you to take a moment and think about what your intersectional identities are. What are those pieces of you that may not always be consciously at the forefront of your brain, but that are also showing up and impacting your work with clients? So just kind of think about that. You don't have to share that. I just want you to be thinking about it. For me, one way that especially shows up is I am very passionate about making sure that folks that are under the LGBTQIA+ umbrella receive compassionate quality care, while at the same time acknowledging that being cisgender, I don't know what it's like to live inside a trans body. And so I don't want to pretend that that is knowledge that I have. I can be empathetic, I can hold space. I have attended, I don't know how many trainings at this point, about effective techniques for working with trans folks by folks with lived experience. I think that's very important. Shout out to the Affirmative Couch if you don't already have a subscription. But you know, I think that that's something I have to acknowledge when I have a trans client that presents to sessions. I don't want to present myself as something that I'm not, and empower that client to make a decision for themselves about whether I'm going to be a good fit for them. Now, I know fantastic trans clinicians that if a client is looking for someone with lived experience, that I'm able to refer them to, but that's something I should be able to empower a client to do. So it's those kinds of things that I'm talking about when I'm talking about understanding that your intersectional identities are showing up in session, right? So, okay, I wanted to make sure that I mentioned that. All right, so let's hop right into it. This is the interactive part that we're getting into already. I want you to think about, and you can either come off mute or put it into the chat, 3 negative effects of your work as a caregiver. No wrong answers. I'll share first. For me, I would say one of my negative impacts is that it affects my sleep. If I had, you know, a day where I maybe had to, in Florida, our involuntary psych hold is a Baker Act. So if I had to have a client Baker acted, or if I had like a particularly negative interaction with a family, I have a hard time falling asleep that night, and I'll tend to have more restless sleep as a result. Anybody else? Negative effects.
For me, I'll withdraw in my home life. And so that's my marker. I'm more exhausted, more irritable. And I can kind of manage it at work, but once I get home, I'm kind of fall apart, which is probably not the best place to do that.
Absolutely. Thanks for sharing, Nikki.
Yeah, I think for me, I noticed that in my anxiety, especially in regards to my parenting, I work primarily with children. And so as I hear things and then wanting to safeguard them and bringing some of those fears of what I'm hearing at work into my personal life.
There's a lot of crossover, right? Yeah. Okay. Did anybody, as we were sharing, thank you so much, Colleen. Did anybody think to themselves, hey, that happens to me too? Right? And I think that's one of the insidious things about compassion fatigue is we convince ourselves that we are the only ones struggling. I think that by and large, as I've presented to clinicians, that's who I primarily present to, we take it on as a failure. There must be something wrong with me. I must be doing something wrong. Did I get into the wrong field? Do I not have enough training? Is this not what I'm supposed to be doing? We tend to go to that place. And because we isolate, we're not talking to other clinicians about what we're experiencing, it just becomes this hole that we sink deeper and deeper into. So one of the reasons that we start here is because I'm hoping that we can normalize that this is something that happens to probably all of us at one point or another. And it's not a good thing or a bad thing. It just is, right? So hopefully, as you heard other people on the call sharing some of the things that they experience, you're able to give yourself a little bit of grace, and you're able to give yourself a little bit of, okay, so it's not just me, right? And speaking of it's not just me, I want to give you a little bit of backstory as to how I came to this place. So back in 2020, when everything was going on and we were at the height of lockdown and all of that, I was seeing all of the stuff about nurses and the hospitals and how overwhelmed they were. And I was thinking, my goodness, we're going to end up with an entire generation of nurses that have PTSD. And that's already hard enough work to do. And as I tell the clients that I work with, when a problem feels too big to solve, I want you to try to bring it down to your corner of the universe and think about what change you can impact in where you are. And so I ended up partnering with the Dean of Nursing down in St. Pete, and she gave me a platform to do sessions on Saturdays, just kind of like support sessions for nurses and opportunity for them to share, come together. And I didn't really feel equipped. I didn't feel like I was doing a good enough job to help these nurses. So me being me, I was like, well, obviously I need to go get some more training, not knowing that it was going to, and I mean this literally, change the trajectory of my life. I had done my trauma training with Dr. Eric Gentry, and you're going to hear his name a lot, and you'll see it on just about all of my slides. And when I saw that he was doing a training on compassion fatigue, was like, great, sign me up. I love Dr. Gentry. He speaks truth and his stuff works for me. And I then had the privilege of being part of his first cohort, that professional resilience training that was mentioned in my bio. I learned directly from Dr. Gentry. We completed a 6-month training with him where I learned from him how to present his information. And I do consider it an honor and a privilege to be able to share his research with the world, because it really has changed my life. So I don't just come at this from an academic place, although yes, that is important. It also has enabled me to realize that I get to decide how long I get to do this work. I think that there's a tendency in our field to have this attitude that it's only a matter of time before you burn out. And, you know, for some people that may be 20 years, and for some people that may be 2 years, and that's kind of on you. And we kind of take it for granted. And I think that's honestly what we tell a lot of counselors that are up and coming, and just joining the field rather than helping them. And that's just not true. You know, if you know how to sustain yourself, then you get to decide how long you do this work. And that's not something that I knew, especially when I was working in community mental health. So the things that I learned from Dr. Gentry, the things that I'll be sharing with you today, have significantly improved my quality of life and have enabled me to really reignite my passion for being able to help people. And that's why I'm really excited to be here today, sharing with you not just the science, but a lot of the stories of how this has shown up for me in my real world, because I try to live and breathe this stuff every single day. All right. So hopefully you'll kind of hear that as we're going through also. So I'm going to give my second shout out to Dr. Gentry. So I brought this with me today. This is his most recent publication, and it is Forward-Facing Professional Resilience. And it was written by him and Dr. Dietz. If I have time, I'm going to be showing you a video by Dr. Dietz, who's an emergency room physician. But this is his research on what you're going to be hearing about today. So, and I'm happy to share that link with you folks, if that's something that you're interested in purchasing. Let's hop into what we're going to be talking about today. So compassion fatigue, what does it mean? I think it's a word that we throw around a lot. We don't necessarily know what it means. So the most widely accepted definition of the term was developed by Dr. Charles Figley back in 1995. And he defined compassion fatigue as a combination of two things. It is burnout plus secondary trauma. So it is a state of exhaustion and dysfunction, biologically, psychologically, and socially, which comes about as a result of prolonged exposure to compassion stress and all that it invokes. This is a pretty meaty definition. We're going to break it down so that you have a better understanding. Now, when Dr. Gentry was working on his doctorate degree, he actually studied directly under Dr. Charles Figley. So the research that you're getting today is, goodness, Dr. Gentry's been working on it for like 25, 30 years at this point. Now, we're going to come back to this, and you're going to hear this a lot. So burnout plus secondary trauma. So let's break down what those two things mean, because it's kind of two parts of the equation. The first one is secondary traumatic stress. So secondary traumatic stress is caused by witnessing or interacting with traumatized or suffering clients. So when you're listening to narratives over and over and over again, which I don't know about you, but I kind of feel like that may be the first line of our job descriptions, right? I mean, that's what we do. We sit with people and we're present with them through the worst things of their lives. Yeah. The symptoms of secondary traumatic stress are almost identical to PTSD, especially when you look at that breakdown of those intrusion and avoidance symptoms. And the onset is gradual as well as cumulative. Normally, we're not the ones that notice that we are suffering from secondary traumatic stress. It's the people around us that are saying things like, you know, you don't seem like yourself, or maybe you're a little bit more irritable. We tend to immediately get defensive when we hear those kinds of comments. We don't want to hear it. But typically it's the people around us that are going to notice before we do. And behavior resolution as well as resiliency are the key to handling these symptoms that come up. So that's one half of that equation. The other half is going to be burnout. Now, there are several points today at which I'm going to ask you to take a journey with me to make a perceptual shift, and this is the first one. We think that burnout is caused by a demanding and toxic environment. I think that's what a lot of the stuff says out there in the culture. The real cause of burnout, as Dr. Gentry posits, is the perceptions, our perceptions of that demanding and toxic environment. So the symptoms, which we'll get into much more detail about, but as a brief overview, can range from anxiety to compulsivity to hopelessness. And the solution, which is what his research has shown, is perceptual resolution as well as resiliency. So Dr. Gentry redefines burnout as the chronic condition of perceived demands outweighing perceived resources. So hold on to that piece of things because we're going to break down what that really means. And then, so all of this was already hard. All of this was already complex. And then there came a pandemic. So I won't read you everything that I pulled from the statistics, but pretty much every large body that has been doing research on the impacts of COVID has shown that people are in general feeling more anxious. People are in general feeling more depressed. It's been a negative impact. So these are some of the statistics from the American Psychological Association. And you can see here that our underrepresented communities are more negatively impacted than their white counterparts. The Kaiser Family Foundation found something very similar: more anxiety, more depression. And again, different body, but finding the same thing, that our underrepresented populations are experiencing it more keenly than their white counterparts. And then finally, the National Center for Health Statistics, which, by the way, this is a readily available resource, and the CDC updates it very regularly. These stats are coming to you from the end of March. So in 2019, nationally, 6.5% of adults reported experiencing symptoms of anxiety. That number had shot up to 18.2% as of March of 2024. That's a huge jump. In 2019, 10.8% of adults reported symptoms of depression, as compared to 14.2%, again, at the end of March of this year. Again, big jump when you're talking about thousands of people nationwide. And that's not including the other factors that are negatively impacting our mental health. There's race-based violence against minority populations. There was a shooting yesterday, right? Speaking of which, gun violence. There's anti-LGBTQ IA plus legislation. I live in Florida. We are unfortunately claimed fame for a lot of that nonsense that's going on. There's the overturning of Roe v. Wade. There's a lot of global unrest. The war in Ukraine is dragging on. There's a genocide happening in Gaza. So there's a lot that we have going on that is weighing on us with work that was already hard. And so I think that another thing that we don't oftentimes credit ourselves is that we're human too, right? If anybody has access to this, please let me know. I haven't found a study yet that specifically addresses, with a large enough sample population, the impact of COVID specifically on mental health professionals. There's a lot out there on essential workers, on nurses, on physicians. The American Counseling Association put out a study, but their sample size was very small, so I don't include those numbers in here. But if anybody finds one, please send it along to me because I'm happy to include that. I just haven't come across anything that surveyed us as a body with what I felt like was a large enough sample size. I think the ACA study was like under 20 people. And again, valuable information, but for something like this, I want a larger number to represent statistically. So there's a lot going on, right? We have a lot going on because we are people too at the end of the day. So a couple of questions for you. And again, you can come off of mute or you can put it into the chat if you feel more comfortable with that. What did you learn when you were in graduate school about how to do therapy effectively in the middle of a pandemic? What did that look like for you?
Sure didn't.
Right?
Mhm.
I got nothing. I
Yeah,
learned
same here.
absolutely nothing. No, and Argosy was a fantastic program. I really feel like I learned a lot at Argosy. All of my professors were clinicians working in the field, which I think was incredibly impactful. And nobody mentioned anything to me about doing therapy in the middle of a pandemic. And the way that it happened for me, I was working at a private practice at the time. And on that Friday, it was like the middle of March 2020, the psychiatrist that owned the practice said, we have to switch to telehealth because this thing is bad. And I don't want any of you getting sick. And I definitely don't want any of our clients getting sick. So as of Monday, we're just switching over to telehealth. She did it before the state of Florida did. Shocking, I know. Um, I'm a New Yorker. I just live in Florida. But I had only had one telehealth client before March of 2020. And then all of a sudden, my entire caseload was telehealth, right? Then we have the added complexity of what did you learn about working with clients while you were experiencing the same trauma as them in real time? What did those conversations look like for you? Right? I'm seeing some shrugs. But again, I don't really think we learned a whole lot of that. I remember learning things in grad school like, I've experienced grief in my life, right? And so I can pull on that. I can draw upon that when I'm sitting with a client who has a recent loss and is coming to me because they are also experiencing grief. That is a very different thing than, if you flash back 4 years ago, sitting in my house and hearing the clients that I was working with express to me how sad they were and how anxious they were and how much they miss their family and how much they miss their friends and how they just wanted to go to the grocery store for its sake. And, even the clients that I worked with that were introverts were, ready to go and like be at a baseball game. And I'm sitting on the other end of the computer and thinking to myself, same friend, same. And then we all watched George Floyd in real time as our clients were experiencing it. And then we watched the events of January 6th in real time as our clients were experiencing it. Again, I'm missing a lot of things, but you kind of get where I'm going with this, right? The other thing that shifted for me is I think in grad school, they teach us to have this wall between us and our clients. Obviously, any client that comes to us, there's going to be a power differential just automatically, right? We're the ones with the degree hanging on the wall and all of that stuff. But now they're in my home. And when I work from home, I have my cat and my dog with me. And my cat doesn't care whether or not I'm in session. She's going to come and stand here. So, oh, is that your cat? What's your cat's name? How old is she? Where did you get her from? And so it became very intimate in a way that therapy was not before for me. Even in my work office here, I don't have a photo of my husband anywhere in my office. I have a photo of my cat. But there was that wall between us, I think. And then with telehealth, they were in our homes and we were in their homes. And I think it broke down, for me anyways, a lot of that almost holding myself separate from clients, because I think that's what they teach us to do, which, yes, obviously ethically, I'm not going to share everything with my clients, but at the same time, how can you watch the events of George Floyd being murdered and not be very present with your clients at the anger and the injustice and all of that, right? And so I think that for a lot of us, doing that work in our home and letting our clients into our lives in a way that we had not before, and in a way that honestly they taught us was ethically incorrect, really changed the dynamic that we had with them and the way that we approach the work that we're doing. At the same time, though, because we were so isolated and because we were no longer in offices processing with people, we ended up becoming these little siloed islands, and we weren't talking to anybody about what was going on, and we didn't really have consultation groups going on. And at the same time, if you don't do what we do for a living, I don't think people really understand what a weird intersection we're at. Because, here we are watching, let's say, January 6th unfold. I still remember I had a client that morning that was like, "Are you seeing this?" And I'm like, "I'm in session with you. No, I'm not seeing this. I'm on the phone with, or on the computer with you." We're watching this stuff unfold in real time, and we're experiencing the anger and the horror and the sadness and all of those things while we're trying to help our clients process it in real time when we really haven't wrapped our minds around it ourselves. Yeah. But again, unless you do the work that we do, you don't really get how that is. Yeah. I think another thing that a lot of people in our field don't understand, and again, why I'm hoping you can give yourself a little bit of grace, is our work is incredibly exhausting. My husband is kind of like second in command at his job, and he has lots of big important meetings every day, and he's doing all of that stuff. But if I have 3 trauma sessions, right, with like really deep trauma and clients who were doing really good work and we were really digging deep and we were getting down into it, that's as exhausting, or maybe more so, than him having a 12-hour day of back-to-back meetings. And again, unless you do what we do, I don't think people understand that about the work that we do, the amount of energy it takes for us to genuinely be with clients and to genuinely hold space for them as they are going through their deepest, darkest stuff, which is what we do, right? So I say all of this to say, I'm hopeful that you can kind of like start shifting around your process, your thought process a little bit, and see that you are not alone. We have been in a very difficult place, I mean, through our whole career, but especially since COVID-19 started impacting things, and that it doesn't make you a failure and it doesn't make you bad at what you're doing, all right? So let's get into a little bit of what the symptoms of compassion fatigue look like. Dr. Gentry breaks these down into 5 major categories. There is the physical, there is the psychological, there's the emotional, there's the spiritual, and there's the professional. In a few slides from now, we're actually going to go through a checklist, but I want you to just kind of take a glance at this and think about where you're at, personally, as you came to this space today. But also, at the very beginning, I asked you to list off some of the things that are the negative impacts of your work as a caregiver, right? And you can see that some of what we were talking about at the very beginning is reflected here on this slide. Yeah. Now, I promised you at the beginning that there was going to be a self-assessment tool. You actually have a few of them in your packet. My favorite one, and the one that I recommend most often to clients and to clinicians that I present to, is the ProQual. They are on the 5th iteration right now. So right now it's the ProQual 5, and that stands for the Professional Quality of Life Scale. I like it, one, because it's free. And if you do any kind of digging into the body of research on compassion fatigue, I have come across very few articles that did not mention the ProQual as their measure of symptoms. So it is a 30-question item. It's a self-report measure of both the positive and negative aspects of caring. Now, what it does is it measures both compassion satisfaction as well as compassion fatigue. Now, the really cool thing is what the research tells us, and this is part of what Dr. Gentry's research covers as well. Compassion satisfaction, the good stuff about what we do, the stuff that keeps us coming back day after day, is actually a protective factor. If you have a high compassion satisfaction score, that can help immunize you against the effects of compassion fatigue. So let's say that you have, an incredibly high stress job. I mean, it is intense, maybe you're at like a state psychiatric hospital. That's like really hard work, like every day. But if you have a high compassion satisfaction score, that can help immunize you and protect you and help you have longevity in that particular work location. So it's important that you know that about yourself. And those are the kind of things I think about those moments as, maybe you've been working with a client who just really struggles with boundaries, right? And you log on and in your next session with them, they're like, actually had this happen to a client a few years ago. They were like, my sister called me and told me she was going to come and she's coming down here for vacation. And I told her it wasn't a good week for me. And they almost fall out of their chair because I can't believe that they did it. And you're so proud of them, right? Because you've been working on boundaries for forever and they've never been able to stand up to this sister. That's compassion satisfaction. Those are the moments where your client who's been struggling with infertility gets pregnant and everything's going well and you're so excited. Like that's the stuff that keeps us coming back, right? It's important that you know what that is for yourself. Ideally, at this point, you're not surprised to hear that the compassion fatigue part of the ProQual has two subscales. Surprise, surprise, it measures your burnout and your secondary trauma, because as we now know, those are two pieces of the equation that we need to meet that definition of compassion fatigue. So I would recommend, and you do have it as part of your packet, that everybody take the ProQual. I used to build in time to do it into these presentations, but I found that some people finished it in 5 minutes and some people finished it in 20 minutes. And then it was like this really awkward silence while we were waiting for everybody to finish. So I don't do that anymore. However, if you go to proqual.org, the really nice thing is that you can actually do it online. And so if you work with anybody that's a caregiver, when I have clients that I'm working with who are nurses, who are veterinarians, who are educators have never heard of compassion fatigue, physicians, first responders, law enforcement, hospice workers, anybody that's under that caregiving umbrella, this is an important thing for them to know. And I will take, I typically will do this in one of my first sessions with them. I'll take maybe 5 to 10 minutes. I'll have them bring up the site. I'll have them complete it in real time, and then we'll go over what their scores mean. It's very valuable information for you to have. It's also very valuable information for them to have. It's pretty easy to understand. I have it up on the next slide here. This is what it looks like. The paper version, the online version is the same thing. So it's just a Likert scale, and it does ask you where you've been for the last 30 days. Okay. So I'm going to encourage you to take the ProQual today, if you have time, maybe take like 5-10 minutes on your lunch break and just see where you're at. Because if you don't know where you're at, it's very difficult to make any kind of changes, right? The other thing that I would encourage you to do, if anybody on this Zoom is in a position where they manage other people or they supervise other people, or your clients are in that kind of position, think about doing this with your team. I actually had the pleasure of presenting to the folks at the Victim Service Center here in Orlando. And that was actually management knew what they were getting into when they invited me in. And I had them, I did this presentation in 2 parts for them, and I had them take the ProQual the first time that I went in, and then we waited, I think it was about 2 months for me to come back in and do the second part, and then they compared their grades essentially side by side. You can have the folks on your team do this anonymously. They don't have to share the results with you, but I do think it's very eye-opening for you to see what you're working with. I think especially in hospitals, they don't ever think about this kind of thing. It's just this is what you signed up for, this is how it is kind of attitude, right? I find that to be especially true for nurses. Nurses are overworked and underpaid like nobody's business. But if you know what you're dealing with, then hopefully you can put some things into place to help provide them with a better quality of life. So also, if you do presentations, ProQual is a very, very generous organization. They will allow you to share it. You can photocopy it, you can reproduce it. They just ask two things. One, that you don't change it. And two, if you do, present it to a group of people, that you give folks the website where they're able to access it. Okay. So what Dr. Gentry developed, and what I'm going to ask you to do now, here's more of that interactive stuff, is this is kind of a shortened version of the ProQual, and it's a symptom checklist for compassion fatigue. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through this kind of slowly. And as I have this slide up, I'm going to ask you to take a look at each one of these categories and just check off under the physical symptoms, the psychological symptoms, the emotional symptoms, the spiritual symptoms, and then the professional symptoms, how many more of, or how many of those ring true for you. And what you'll see is that 5 or more checked symptoms could indicate that you may be suffering from compassion fatigue. So if you were hearing me talk about the ProQual and you're like, I don't really need that, but you have 15 things checked off on this list, hopefully that's an indicator to you that you should take a deeper dive into the ProQual. So under physical symptoms, have you had to use more sick days? Have you been feeling physically ill? Have you been struggling with fatigue? You've been feeling more keyed up and nervous or anxious. You're doing less rather than more exercise. You haven't really been able to sleep. You've lost enjoyment in both intimate and sexual activities. You have been maybe more cynical and pessimistic. You're trying to avoid feelings because you're trying to be numb, or you're shutting yourself down. You're having nightmares about work. You're not having enjoyment in activities that you participate in. You're struggling with making decisions, or maybe you're making poor decisions. You've lost some of your self-esteem. You have anger that's directed towards your supervisors or coworkers. Maybe you're feeling flat, depressed, hopeless, more so than you used to. You've been more angry and irritable than normal. Moments of dread when you think about going to work. I used to sit in the parking lot. This is a true story. When I worked in community mental health, and I had to convince myself, I had to like talk myself to walking into the building. I didn't know about compassion fatigue then, but man, I'm having trouble finding hope. You're less connected to your spiritual and religious beliefs than you used to be. You felt overwhelmed more than 3 times in the past week. Maybe you're avoiding spending time with friends and family. You're fearing for the safety of yourself and your loved ones. You've engaged less rather than more in activities that used to bring you pleasure. You have a lack of time for yourself. You're finding it difficult to trust other people, struggling with feelings of despair and hopelessness. And then you've been unable to get work or something specific to work out of your head. You've got unwanted memories popping up in your head of past events from work. Your productivity has been reduced. I know we all struggle with getting our notes done, but I'm talking about more pronounced. Maybe you felt like quitting your job more than once. And you're finding that paperwork and menial tasks are getting in the way of your enjoyment of work. Okay. So hopefully you have a number for yourself. You don't have to tell me. That's just something for you to reflect on. And maybe do a deeper dive. Take the ProQual, see where you're at. And the really nice thing about the ProQual, and it is in your packet, there is a page that explains the breakdown of what each of those numbers mean. So what does your number on the burnout scale mean? What does your number on the secondary traumatic stress mean? What does your number on the compassion satisfaction score mean? Now, here is something that I do want to mention, because sometimes when I do the ProQual with clients, they'll get a number that's kind of mid-range and they're like, look, that says moderate. That means I'm good. And I say, I want you to slow down a little, friend, because I want you to think about the development of the ProQual measure. They measured it based on people that were suffering. So they went to professionals that were struggling as a result of the work that they're doing. And they're like, here's the thing, tell us how you're feeling. So those moderate results that you think are not so bad are in fact probably worse than you've even been recognizing or allowing yourself to think about, because it was normed on a body of people that were suffering from the work that they do. So I always want to put that in, because sometimes people are like, I'm good. I'm okay. I don't have to deal with this compassion fatigue stuff. I'm like, I wish that were true for you. So just kind of keep that in mind. All right, hopefully you have a number there. And another thing that you should know about yourself is about your ACEs. So the ACEs stands for the Adverse Childhood Experiences. I think most clinicians are familiar with this. I don't think, though, that most clinicians think about how your ACEs impacts the work that they do. I think most clinicians have a tendency to focus this outward. There's another one of those moments where I'm going to challenge you to turn that mirror inward. So if you're not as familiar with it, and I have it up on the next screen, it gives you a total score out of a possible 10. I know there's other iterations. This is just the classic one that was developed. It measures your areas of trauma, such as abuse and neglect. And what we know, thanks to a large body of research, the body keeps the score, all of that, your ACEs results correlates to both your physical and mental health as an adult. So the higher your ACEs score is, the likelier it is that you are going to develop, things like high blood pressure, diabetes, different kind of mental health conditions. You tend to have a shorter lifespan, all of those things, right? The other thing is that the higher your ACEs score is, the likelier it is that you are constantly living in a state of sympathetic nervous system dominance. So your fight or flight mode is what's controlling the majority of your decision making and how you're navigating through your universe. So what then happens is when you are exposed to secondary traumatic stress, so let's kind of go back to the beginning when we were talking about what that means. That's listening to these narratives over and over again, right? Like that's what causes it. What happens is your brain processes that as a threat. And that is what is then leading you into the symptoms of compassion fatigue. So it's another one of those weird intersections that we're at, because by and large, those of us that get into caregiving fields do this because we have some kind of history with trauma, right? Maybe we had a childhood that was traumatic. Maybe we have a history of substance use. Maybe we, worked with a clinician that was horrible, and we were like, I'm going to become a therapist so that I never do this to anybody, and people get quality care. Whatever it is that draws us to this field, on the flip side of that is also what makes us vulnerable to symptoms of compassion fatigue. So the very work that you do, the very act of sitting in a session with a client and hearing their narrative, hearing their story of what it is that they're experiencing, is sending your nervous system to have your sympathetic nervous system being in charge of what's going on. And you may not consciously be aware that you're spending your entire day in fight or flight. And then you get home and you're planting face first in bed, and you're not really understanding how those things are connected. So let's shed a little bit of light as to what that looks like. First, I have the ACEs score up here. I'm going to go quiet for the next, 30 seconds or so. If you're not already familiar with what your ACEs score is, go ahead and take a moment. Just go through it. And every question that you answer yes to gives you a 1. And that gives you a total out of 10. Sometimes we also have a tendency to try to convince ourselves things weren't as bad as they were. So I'm going to challenge you to be honest with yourself. You don't have to share your ACEs score with me. This is just for you to know. And this is another one of those pieces of your intersectional identity that walks into the room with you when you're working with clients. Okay. While you're working on that, I will also say another thing. I'm a big proponent. I'm a former elementary school teacher. And so I'm a big proponent on having clients understand themselves better, right? Psychoeducation, I think, is a huge part of what we do. And if you do trauma work, so many of the people that we work with tend to come to us and think that they're broken in some way, there's something wrong with them. And when I break out a score or a tool like the ACEs, and we can objectively measure what happened in their childhood, it starts to break down that this thing happened to me 30 years ago. Why is it still bothering me? I should be over it by now. And so I found that this is a very, it's like a nice wedge to start opening that door into you're only human, and look at what you survived. And no wonder you have panic attacks every time you're in the middle of a Walmart, right? So it starts to challenge that narrative that they tend to build in their heads. Okay. So I have another interactive slide for you. Is your job stressful? Show of hands. How many of you would say that? Okay. I'm at work. I can say this. I love my job, and my job is stressful. So here's what I'm going to challenge you to do on a piece of paper that you have handy. I'm going to ask you to build a little chart for yourself. And it's just a cause and effect. Nothing super official. And what I'm going to ask you to do, or invite you to do, is think about some of these effects that we've been talking about. We're actually going to fill in the effect side of the paper first. And you're going to answer that second question, which is, what are some of the negative impacts on stress on your life? So far, we've talked about that feeling of like numbing and shutting down. We've talked about sleep disturbance. We've talked about not having as much like energy to be with the people that we love, the people in our lives. I have a lot of clinicians that report to me that they get headaches or GI trouble. GI trouble is another really common one that I get a lot of. Sometimes I have clinicians that are like, I'm always sick. You know, I get this cold and it lingers for weeks. And then as soon as I think I'm over it, the next week I'm back into something else. And it's like, it's your nervous system. You know, so just think about what some of those negative impacts are. I'm not looking for you to list a certain number of things, just looking for you to gain a little bit of insight as to what you may be dealing with. Anybody think of anything that we haven't already discussed that they're willing to share?
I put down forgetful. When I'm really stressed out, it's really hard for me to be present and to remember things.
That's a big one. That's a red flag for me too. That absolutely is a red flag for me. Yeah. I missed a deadline on something for another presentation that I was doing, and I was like, oh my God, I'm so sorry. I didn't submit all of my stuff. That's a huge one. Thanks, Mara. Appreciate that. I notice I get more clumsy too. Like I'm clumsy at my baseline, but I'll be walking around the house and my husband is like, that doorway was always there. It has not shifted. All right, so as you probably guessed, we're going to be filling in the other part of the chart now. So these are the negative impacts of stress on your life. Now I want you to think about the causes of stress in your life. And this usually goes 50-50. My top answer that I almost always get is either finances or family. And I won't tell your family if you put them on this list, I promise. It'll be between us. You can love them and they can be the most significant cause of stress in your life. Those two things are not exclusionary. I'm still not looking for a certain number of things. Just looking for you to think about what those causes of stress in your life are. One of mine is this Orlando traffic. Graciousness. This morning on my way into work, I'm like, why? Why are we braking? Why? The light's green. Green means go. Okay. So you can keep writing as we kind of talk through and process through things. Is there anybody that is willing to share one of the causes of stress in their life? If you feel more comfortable, you can pop it in the chat and we won't say who it's from.
For me, because I've been in Iowa for 2 years now, but I came from a really big family support and I really have none here, although I haven't made efforts to find any too, but that's something that causes stress because I don't have like all of my family is there. And now it's just kind of my husband, me and my kids. And that's all I have. And so I find that to be extremely stressful, especially when things pop up. Like my daughter just recently had a major surgery. And so like things like that, I'm like, oh, I don't have supports. Where are my people at? I mean, my mom's here now, but those are things that I'm like, oh, if I wasn't here, if I was there, then I'd have those supports. And so that's something that is kind of always in the forefront of my mind.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you for sharing. Just that.
Yeah, I was empathetically giggling with you when you're talking about traffic, right? Because it made me think of some of the like more humorous stressors in my life. And what came to mind is daycare dress up days, because we're currently in the middle of a different one for the last 26 days of
Oh my
school.
goodness.
But I think what that feeds into for me as well is my bigger stressor of just trying to find that balance between working full-time and parenting full-time and kind of being the default parent and scheduler, both at work and at home, like being responsible for lots of other people.
It's a lot to manage, for sure. Yeah. I'm shocked nobody said finances.
I had it on my list when you said it at the top of my list, but I was like, okay, yeah.
It's always in the top two, always. Okay, so now what I'm going to challenge you to do is I want you to take a look at that list of causes that you made, and thank you to those of you that shared. And I'm going to ask you to look at it through this lens. What things on your list of causes is presently posing a life-threatening danger to you? Not a trick question. But when I ask it that way, the answer is none, isn't it? Right? So here's where we get into the neuroscience stuff. I'm not arguing that those things are not stressful, right? I'm not arguing that they are not negatively impacting your life. What I am asking you, though, is are any of those things on your list right now, in this very moment, posing a life-threatening danger to you? And when you look at it through that lens, the answer is nothing, right? So there's my follow-up question, which is, are you 100% safe right now? We have yes, we have like, I don't know. I'm seeing mixed reactions. So my follow-up question to that would be, if you're feeling like you are not 100% safe right now, I'm going to encourage you to look around the room that you're presently in and let me know what is in the room with you right now that is posing a danger to your life right now as we share this time together. And the answer, I hope, should be nothing, because I'm looking at everybody's cameras and I'm not seeing a bear in the room with anybody. So that's okay. Okay, that's good. This is another one of those perceptual shifts that I'm going to ask you to make. And it's a really tough one because our nervous systems are hardwired to keep us alive, right? But what ends up happening is because our nervous systems are so finely attuned to our environments, again, because it is there to keep us alive, we have a tendency to put things into the bucket of life-threatening danger that are not actually life-threatening in this present moment. For me, one of the things that happens is microaggressions. Again, I navigate the world as a brown person, and oftentimes that means that I am in a space where There are people that do not look like me. And there are assumptions made about me. There are statements that are made about me, and it activates my nervous system, right? I go into, for me, it's flight mode, and I need to get out of there. And as uncomfortable as those moments are, and as much as I do not enjoy them, they are also not life-threatening. And if I continue to process those microaggressions as life-threatening danger, my cortisol levels are just going to continue to be through the roof, which does not help me access any kind of quality of life, right? So I'm not saying that it's okay that those microaggressions happen, but I don't have control over who those microaggressions are going to come from. I do have control over what happens in my nervous system as those things come up for me. So let's get a little bit into more about what that means. So we're going to define stress as the perception. I told you that word perception will be coming up a lot, as the perception of threat, right? When your nervous system is like, there is something in the environment that is dangerous. Now, what ends up happening with every single one of us is we have traumagenesis. That is your painful past learning, which is causing you to perceive a threat where there is none. So I was kind of joking about the Orlando traffic, but not really, because I actually was in a car accident in 2020 on I-4. If any of you have been in Orlando, it's like where all the accidents happen. What happens present day, and I'm almost 4 years out from that accident, whenever I get onto I-4, whether I'm on there as a passenger or whether I'm the driver of a car, my whole body tenses up. And I don't get onto I-4 thinking to myself, I'm going to be in a tense body right now, because that sounds like fun. My nervous system remembers what happened. It gets worse the closer I get to the exit where the accident happened, because my nervous system remembers that trauma, and my nervous system remembers that situation that occurred. So that's traumagenesis. Present day 2024 nervous system is responding to what happened to my nervous system in 2020, right? And what I want you to reflect upon for a moment is the thousands, if not millions, of examples that you have in your life of traumagenesis that are causing you to perceive danger for 2024 you that actually references something that maybe happened 20, 30 years ago. Okay. Now, again, this is not a conscious thing. Your nervous system is essentially a radar, right? And it's doing it right now. Mine is doing it right now too, where it's scanning your environment. It's doing it right now. It's like, are we going to die? 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 And what your nervous system perceives as a threat may be different than what my nervous system perceives as a threat, because my traumagenesis is different from your traumagenesis. But if you don't know what those things are, you're going to continue being in this loop of fight or flight that's just controlling your day-to-day responses to like everything. So what I'm going to challenge you to do is, in every situation that causes you to tense up, and we're going to go through some exercises so you're able to recognize that, I want you to ask yourself, is this a real threat or is this a perceived threat? If you're not literally, and I mean that in the most literal sense of the words, if you're not literally about to die, it's a perceived threat. I would argue 99% of your universe is perceived threat. Even for those things that make you uncomfortable, even for those things that make you angry or upset or whatever you want to classify it as. And if it's not a real threat, if you're not literally about to die, you don't actually need your threat response, okay? When you think about the neuroscience of your threat response, it's necessary. I'm not saying we don't need it. But what I am saying is, I love the way Dr. Gentry phrases this, because he'll say to you, statistically, we are in the safest period of time in history because of the advances that have been made to science. Things like vaccinations, things like safety features on cars. I had no idea cars had so many airbags till I was in a car where every single airbag went off and I was surrounded by all of these, airbags that went off. Statistically, we are in the safest period of time in history, and yet we are more anxious as a species than we ever have been, even with all of those safety advances. And part of that is because we're stuck in this 24/7 news cycle where we have access to all of these things that we're watching with horror and that are initiating our fight or flight response, right? So what you have to do is you have to get to the place where you're looking at everything through that lens. When I start to break this down for clients who especially struggle with panic attacks, so if you're in the middle of a Walmart and your fight or flight response kicks in, are you about to die? What's in the canned good aisles that's literally about to kill you? Is there a bear in a Walmart? And they laugh. And I'm like, unless there's a bear stampeding through that Walmart, you're not about to die in that moment. And it takes time. I'm not saying this is an overnight thing, but eventually they're hopefully able to get to the point where they can walk into, can you be inside a Walmart for 2 minutes? Just try that. Let's start from there. And then maybe eventually you can purchase one item and get the heck out of there. And then maybe eventually you can actually work on your shopping list, right? But you have to come to that. Are you literally about to die? And the fact that you have these thousands of examples of traumagenesis does not mean that there's something wrong with you. It means that your nervous system has been working very hard, as it should be, because that's its job, to keep you alive. What ended up happening is because of the things that you've experienced in your life, your classification system got a little skewed, right? You've got 2 buckets of information. There's the bucket of things that will kill you, and there's the bucket of things that will not kill you. Because of the things that you've experienced, and I tie this back to the ACEs, your bucket of things that will kill you is pretty big. It's overflowing. But some of that stuff got misclassified. That's not your fault. That's not your fault. We just have to help your nervous system learn a different way of classifying things. That's what we're working on. So if, as a clinician, you're able to handle your stress, your perception of threat, in a relaxed body, that's going to be the most effective way to ensure that the therapeutic work that you do is getting encoded in your brain as an event, as a thing that occurred, not as a trauma. And this is especially true for those of us that work with clients that have similar experiences to what we do. So let's break that down a little bit further. What ends up happening is, here's, I think, a good example of this. Let's say that you grew up in a household where there was domestic violence and substance abuse by your primary caregivers. And you, being the amazing person that you are, decided that you wanted to become a clinician so you could help other people be able to process through those things. So now you have a client that comes to you and they're telling you about how horrible their childhood was, and there was domestic violence and there was substance abuse by their primary caregivers. Not consciously, but in your nervous system is screaming at you, danger, Will Robinson, danger. You need to get the heck out of there, or you need to fight through this thing, because your nervous system is going back to, 5-year-old version of you or 4-year-old version of you as you're listening to this narrative that your client is sharing with you, right? So what your job then becomes, in order to be sustainable, is to recognize when that's happening so that you can better be present with the clients that you're working with. Now, the other thing that I do want to make sure that I include here is this. Sometimes there is a very direct line between the trauma that occurred and how that shows up in your nervous system presently. And that's my example of being in that car accident in 2020, right? Like, I think anybody can pretty much draw that line from point A to point B. Sure, your accident happened on I-4. Now, whenever you get onto I-4, your nervous system is like, run away, run away. Unfortunately, not all of our traumagenesis is that easy to classify. Remember, your nervous system is online pretty much all the time, right? It's serving as a radar system. It's been serving as a radar system, honestly, since you were in utero. Yeah. And that's not always going to be things that you consciously remember. So take, for example, my littlest nephew right now is 2. He's got a sweet tooth, like nobody's business. So if we go out for breakfast on a Sunday morning, he likes maple syrup, so you can drown anything in maple syrup and he'll eat it. So let's say that he gets waffles, right? We're at the time of year in Florida where you can eat outside and it's not 5,000 degrees. And he gets stung by a bee. So 20 years from now, he may not remember that that happened. He's only 2, but his nervous system will remember that it happened. And he may develop a lifelong aversion to maple syrup. Now, it wasn't the maple syrup that hurt him, it was the bee sting. However, remember that classification system? Will it kill me? Will it not? In his nervous system, the smell of maple syrup is now associated with the pain of the bee sting, right? And so 20 years from now, he may not even consciously know why he's hated maple syrup his whole life. It's just he can't stomach it. He doesn't want to be anywhere around it. And for a lot of us, that's how our traumagenesis works. It's not even anything that we consciously remember. So what I encourage clients to do, I'm like, the point of this is not that you remember. I don't want you standing in the middle of the Walmart trying to figure out why your nervous system is going into fight or flight. That's not the point of this. The point of this is to recognize what's going on inside your body so that you can gain control of your fight or flight response. You may not ever know why your nervous system decided that you needed to have a panic attack in the middle of Walmart. I don't want you spending your time doing that. What I want you to be able to do is to recognize when that's happening for you so that you can utilize your coping skills and fend off that panic attack. Everybody with me so far? Okay. So, well, you're like, well, great, Natasha, how do we do that? And that comes to recognizing what's happening inside your body, which is not a game that many of us are very good at. So I want to go through some exercises with you that I hope you pass on to the clients that you work with that are going to help you recognize what's going on inside of you so that you can fend off that panic attack or your fight or flight response or however you want to phrase it, okay? So I'm going to ask everybody to do these with me. And if you feel more comfortable doing it off camera, that's fine as well. Most of them you can't really see. But the first one that Dr. Gentry teaches everybody is the wet noodle. And here's how the wet noodle works. So what I'm going to invite you to do is pretend like you're standing and looking at yourself. And you're using, like, you know, Costco has those like laser price things at the checkout counter. So pretend that you're scanning yourself from head to toe. And what I'm going to invite you to do is just do a quick scan from head to toe. If it's easier for you, you can close your eyes. And just kind of become aware of where in your body you're tense right now. Where are your muscles tight? You don't have to answer that. Just kind of become aware. And for me, as I ask that question, I recognize that it's happening especially in my right shoulder. All right, so here is my invitation to you. Here's how the wet noodle works. You're going to do another body scan, but this time what I'm going to do is I'm going to count from 1 to 5. As I count from 1 to 5, we're going to travel from our head down to our feet. And as I count, what I'm going to invite you to do is try to soften up those muscles in your body, not just the ones that you realized were tense, and just kind of be present with that and see what that feels like for you. We're going into all of these exercises with curiosity. There's no right way or wrong way to do them. And let's just see if there's any kind of shift that happens. If you feel more comfortable closing your eyes, you can do that. And then we'll see what happens. All right. All right. So I'm going to start. I prefer closing my eyes when I do this, with 1 at the top of my head, traveling slowly down. 2, 3, 4, and 5. So now we're at the bottom of our feet. And I don't know if anybody saw it, but I could kind of feel my body shift a little bit further down into my chair. I was holding myself tighter than I think I realized I was. But if anybody else shifted, did anybody else shift? Were you able to release a little bit of tension? Okay, great. So what you just did was you interrupted your threat response. There was something going on in your environment that your nervous system was perceiving as a threat. And your ability to shift into a relaxed body was you interrupting your threat response. Congratulations. That's a superpower you didn't know you had before. The next one that I would like to share with you is diaphragmatic breathing. I like this especially for folks that do struggle a lot with panic attacks because they tend to go to that hyperventilation place. So the way, this is the only one that will show up on camera, but the way this one looks is you're going to interlace your fingers in front of you, and then you put your hands behind your head, and you want to push your elbows out just a little bit. It shouldn't hurt. It shouldn't feel uncomfortable. And again, I'm going to count to 5. You do not have to keep pace your breathing with my counting. And just see what happens as I count to 5. Just breathe as you're in this position. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And then you can put your arms down. And I don't know if anybody heard it, but as soon as I got into that position, the first thing that happened was I went, right? And that's because anatomically, when you get yourself into that position, it forces you to take a deeper breath. Okay. The cool thing about that, and that I encourage clients to do, is that's not like a socially awkward position. People do that. So you can be in the middle of a meeting doing that, and they won't know that you're fending off a panic attack because you're the next one up to give your presentation, right? It's kind of a normal thing to sit like that, but you know what you're doing. What you're doing is you're inviting more oxygen into your body. You're encouraging your muscles to relax. And again, you're interrupting your threat response. The next one, this is one of my favorites. So Dr. Gentry teaches the muscle to skeleton exercise. And he loves to tell the story about how when he teaches this to physicians, what he does is he'll ask a room full of physicians, what's the job of your muscles? Well, what do your muscles do? And he'll say in a room full of physicians, he usually gets like blank stares initially, like, what are you talking about? And, you know, some of them will go into the anatomy and what does this and what does this? And he's like, okay, great. But like at the end of the day, what do your muscles do? What's their job? So I'll pose that question to you folks. What do your muscles do? What are they responsible for? Nobody's going to take a stab at it. Your muscles move things, right? That's what they're responsible for. So if your muscles are responsible for moving things, what would you say your skeleton is responsible for?
Supporting things.
Absolutely. Yeah, your skeleton's your framework. That's what holds everything up, right? So here's what I'm going to challenge you to do during the muscle to skeleton exercise. I am going to invite you to give the job of holding you up back over to your skeleton. For a lot of us, that lives in our muscles, and that's not even something that we consciously realize, right? You have been sitting in a chair for the last, hour and however many minutes at this point. I have faith that whatever you have been sitting on is going to continue holding you up for the next 10 seconds as we do this exercise, okay? It will not melt into a puddle on the floor. And again, close your eyes if you feel comfortable doing so, but I want you to experience what it feels like for your skeleton to be what holds you up and not your muscles. And let's see if you can shift that for yourself, okay? So I'm going to count again from 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Okay. Did anybody feel a shift with that one? Yeah. I immediately sank down a little bit more into my chair. I could have gone down further, but I don't want to disappear from the camera. But again, until you do something like this, I don't think you're consciously aware of how much you're like walking, like this is a little exaggerated, but how much you're really walking around like this. Yeah. And then finally, we will do the pelvic floor relaxation. Now, when I work with clients to teach them these exercises, if there is any kind of history of sexual trauma or sexual assault or anything like that, I go into this with a little bit more sensitivity, and I try to frame it as remember, right here, right now, it's you and me. You're not in any kind of life-threatening danger. We're focusing on the here and now. And this is a way for you to reclaim that part of your body and not continue to allow the trauma to have power over you. And again, it's not going to happen in the next 30 seconds, but this can be a slow process of empowerment for you. So just kind of be sensitive of where they're at in their healing journey, if you decide to do this with a client. And same thing for yourselves. So for the pelvic floor relaxation, here's how this one works. What I'm going to ask you to do is physically locate 4 different places on your body. So the first 2 that you're going to locate is right in front where your hip bones stick out. So go ahead and put your hands right on there where your hip bones stick out. And then the second one that you're going to locate is as you're sitting right under your butt, there are 2 places where your bones stick out under your pelvis. So go ahead and find those. All right. And then once you found them, you can get your hands out from underneath you. When you physically touch them, you create a touch memory. It'll help your brain remember how to do this when the session is over. And if you visualize with me, let's connect those dots, right? We make a box inside your pelvis. With me so far? Now your box is at an angle because those hip bones in front are up higher than those bones that you're sitting on, aren't they? Yeah. So I'm going to invite you to bring attention to the space within that box. And I want you to think about the muscle that you use. This is easier for folks that have given birth because they're very familiar with the pelvic floor muscles. Not everybody has given birth, and sometimes we work with clients that were assumed male at birth. And so what I ask them to do is think about the muscles that you use if you need to stop peeing midstream. We've all been to the doctor's office and had to pee into one of those cups, right? Those are the muscles that we're going to focus on right now. So what I'm going to ask you to do is I want you to consciously tense those muscles while I count to 5. Once I get to 5, I'm going to ask you to release them and relax them. But I want you to try to let that relaxed feeling fill up that box that we just made inside that pelvis and just see what that feels like for you. Just be curious about that. The way that I envision this that helps me, if it helps you, then by all means, is when you come across a pond and you throw a stone into the middle and the water ripples out, what we're trying to do is make ripples of relaxation from that point of tenseness. Okay. And again, if you feel more comfortable closing your eyes, you can certainly do that. So we're going to squeeze those muscles for 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Now release it. Let it go. Let that relaxed feeling fill up your pelvis. Some of you will have just realized that you need to pee. And that's a sense of awareness of your body that you didn't have before you did that exercise. We're counting that as a win. So those are some different exercises. There's more that Dr. Gentry has out there. There's a couple of videos that I can pop into the chat at the end. But the bottom line is this. You cannot be stressed in a relaxed body. That's physiologically impossible. So by utilizing these exercises, you can regulate your own threat response. Now, one of the pushbacks that I will get from clients is, well, that's not like a one-time deal. And it is not. I wish that it were. For many of us, this is something that we have to do 100 to 200 times a day. All right. But that's okay. And also, unless you're doing the diaphragmatic breathing, nobody knows that you're doing this, right? You could be having a conversation with your ex who's incredibly traumatizing for you, and you could be doing the wet noodle, or you could be doing the pelvic floor relaxation, and they won't know that. Same thing if it's your boss who happens to be the one that's triggering your panic response. And it's okay if you have to be doing this 200 times a day. What you're doing is you're teaching your nervous system essentially how to move that stuff over from the filing cabinet of things that will kill you to the filing cabinet of things that won't kill you. And I'm hopeful that you take that on as an empowerment thing, right? As a superhero power that you didn't know you had before. So one of my favorite quotes from Dr. Gentry is, until we begin to realize that it is not the environment that causes our stress, but instead what happens inside of us as we navigate through our workday, we are almost certain to continue suffering the effects of stress in both our personal and professional lives. And that shows up for us in so many different ways. Here's another example. Let's say that you're running late on a morning because it was, dressed like a princess to take care and you forgot about it. Now you're trying to find this stupid tiara. And while you're looking for the tiara, one of your kids decided to help themselves to a glass of orange juice, and there's now half of a gallon of orange juice laying all over your kitchen floor. So the puppy comes running over because they're going to help you with this, right? And in the midst of the panic, you spilled your coffee all over the white shirt you decided to wear that day. I think for most of us, even probably describing it, I just undid all those exercises that we just practiced, right? You can feel your stress response coming on. Now, is that inconvenient? Yes. Was it unplanned for? Also, yes. Is any of that a life-threatening danger? No. And if you take 5 seconds and you get yourself into a relaxed body, before you speak to your child that just spilled half a gallon of orange juice all over the floor, you're going to walk away from that conversation having felt better about your response to your child. Because I think for most of us and for most of the clients that we work with, they're going to be like, what did you do? I'm already running late. I don't have time for this. And now I'm trying to clean up orange juice. And then you see your poor child's face. And then you feel horrible. And you go back to them and you apologize 5 minutes later. And, but if you take the 5 seconds to get yourself into a relaxed body, you're going to find that you're coming at it not from your fight or flight response, but from who you really are at your core, right? Most of us tend to be most reactive with those that we loved most, with those that we love most, because we love them the most. We know they're not going to go away. They're stuck with us, right? And what this stuff has done is not only empowered me in my professional life, but it's also empowered me in my personal life too. I love my husband. He also is a cause of stress in my life. And when something happens or when we're having a conversation, utilizing this stuff has given me the space to be able to ask myself, what do you want to happen next here? Which is not something I ever did before. And the answer to that question has never been, I want to get into a great big raging argument about what day we should go to Costco. Right? It's always the stupidest thing. Yeah. But it gives me that space to breathe and actually take a look at it from a higher up view and not from my traumagenesis. Yeah. Okay. So now you've been able to practice some things. And Dr. Gentry has created what he calls the immunization against compassion fatigue. And it has 5 different ingredients. So if you put all of these things together, it's not perfect. I don't by any means claim that I am perfect at this and that I do this every day perfectly all the time in every single situation. But by and large, I try to have this navigate my universe for me. And these are the 5 different ingredients. The first is self-regulation, and that's what we just spent a lot of time talking about. That's your ability to immediately shift from sympathetic to parasympathetic dominance. Remember, your parasympathetic is when you're in your rest and digest mode, right? That's you interrupting your threat response. Even in a session with a client, you can do that. You can do the wet noodle in a session with a client and still be present with them. In fact, you're going to be more present with them if you're regulating your panic response. I have lived that. I know what that feels like. It's also really empowering because I've had this happen before where there's one example that comes to mind where I had a client who was living in a predominantly white neighborhood and he happened to be Black, and he had a situation with a neighbor where he felt very unsafe, and we were kind of processing through it in our session. And I said, actually, what you just shared with me triggered my fight or flight response. And I can hear by the tone of voice, you're in your fight or flight response. Why don't we together take some time and get both of us into a relaxed body before we continue to process what happened? And it really helped him kind of take a look at it through a different lens. Because while it was definitely an uncomfortable situation, he was not in any kind of life-threatening danger in that moment, right? So it's powerful when clients see and hear that you're doing this stuff yourself, like you live it. The next one is intentionality. And this is being able to be principle-based versus demand-driven and getting back to your fealty to covenant. It's a very confusing statement. So let me explain a little bit more about what that means. In the packet of information that you were provided, towards the end of it is an exercise for you to write your mission statement. That's another thing I'm going to challenge you to do soonish. A lot of us, through a combination of different factors, lose sight of why we got into this field, especially the longer that we're in it. We have a tendency to get farther and farther away from what drove us into this field to begin with. And we lose sight of those principles, those core values. So I'm going to encourage you to get back to your fealty to covenant and remind yourself of why you chose to do this work in the first place, right? For me, it was because I wanted to help people. I don't ever remember wanting a career. My grandma loves to tell the story of how when I was 4 years old, I told her I was going to be a teacher. I like always knew that that's what I was supposed to do. I was supposed to help people. And so that's very closely related to the next piece of our immunization, which is perceptual maturation and self-validation. Others' reaction and valuation of you do not or should not determine your behavior, because your integrity is worth more than your reputation. I'm going to say that again. Your integrity is worth more than your reputation. Here is how that showed up for me in a way that I now realize but did not know at the time. When I was working in community mental health, towards the end of my tenure there, they were asking me to commit insurance fraud. They did not pose it that way. They didn't sit me down in an office and say, hey, we want you to commit insurance fraud. What they said was, we want you to take a look at your caseload and see if there's any clients that could benefit from weekly sessions that are coming in every other week, or clients that are only coming to one group a week that maybe should be coming to more groups. And I'm thinking to myself, some of my clients that I work with, we work really hard to get them down to where they were having a session every other week because they felt good enough and stable enough to do that. And it made me so uncomfortable. I didn't know why at the time. Now, with the knowledge that I have, the reason is because that was against my own personal integrity. That was me being principle-based. The community mental health center that I worked at based my performance, based my quality as a clinician on how many sessions I was conducting every month, right? And so, man, this is a story I'll never forget. For my performance review, my boss printed out my billing for the last year and said, in February, you billed this much for the department, but in July, you only billed this much for the department. So what happened there? And I went into flight mode, which is my typical response. And I was like, I don't know. And I just wanted to get out of there. Now looking at it through this lens, what was happening in that moment, they were being demand driven. The only way that they were measuring my worth as a clinician was how many sessions I was conducting. Nobody talked to any of the clients that I was working with and surveyed them about whether or not they felt better or the quality of services that I was providing. It was all about how many sessions did you conduct in a month. And when I was in graduate school, that's not what I was getting into the field for. That's not why I was excited to become a therapist. And so the reason that that panic was happening inside of me is because they wanted me to be demand driven and get away from my fealty to covenant. And that's not who I am as a person or as a clinician. So those two things were never going to measure up. And one question that I get often from clinicians is, are you saying that I need to leave my job? And I don't know. I can't answer that question for you. What I can say is that if you're at a job that is constantly undermining your core values and is making you principle or demand driven rather than principle based, you're going to spend the majority of your day in fight or flight mode. And there's only so much self-regulation you can do to help keep yourself sustainable in that place, right? And so I'll share another story with you that I hope is helpful. Last year, I walked away from a job that on paper looked really great. I was working for a large mental health tech company, and the higher ups were making decisions that were not in the best interest of clinicians. A lot of us complained about feeling burnt out. They were asking us to do too many sessions. It was not sustainable. And their response was to cut benefits and release a video that was like, if you don't like it here, you can essentially find somewhere else to be employed. That wasn't what the video said. That was kind of the underlying message. And I, for the first time in my professional life, said, I need to leave. Every other job transition I had had before the one that I did last year was driven from fear. I left community mental health because my therapist at the time told me, if you don't leave community mental health, you were going to end up not being a therapist before you even get licensed. You need to go work somewhere else. I've always left out of fear and discomfort. And I cannot tell you how empowering it was. It was scary. I'm not saying it wasn't scary. But how empowering it was for me to walk away from a job that, again, on paper looked good. My mom was like, what are you doing? You have health insurance. On paper looked good, but was not lined up with my principles. It was questioning my integrity on a day-to-day basis. And that changed the whole trajectory of my job search. I turned down 5 different job offers before I accepted this one for the place where I'm currently at. And as challenging as it is, because we have some challenging days, I love my job and I love coming into work every day and seeing the residents, even on the days when it's hard, because my job now lines up with my integrity. I work for a CEO who appreciates that I'm principle driven, and I have that support now. But I only got here because I didn't let fear drive this particular career transition for me. And I pulled it off I actually have it on my bookshelf in the corner there that you can see. This is my mission statement that I have written. Dr. Gentry makes you write one when you're doing the training with him. This is version number 5 or 6. I'm actually due to update mine. I haven't updated it in a while. And you have to write it. You can't type it. You have to write it. There's something about getting pen and paper to it that makes it stick to your nervous system. I won't read the whole thing to you, but my favorite sentence is in here is, I will live my life according to my core mission that I am here to help others. Any day that I can go home and I've helped somebody, I have succeeded. Regardless of how many sessions I've done that day, how much I've billed for the department, how many emails I've returned. If I've helped somebody that day, I've succeeded. Today I did my best, and my best is good enough. And that's what drives me now. And it has been a game changer for me, because from now on, I will only work for places that allow me to live according to my mission statement. And I've never had that before I started working here. Thankfully, I work for a CEO who is amazing and appreciates that about me. But some of this change, yes, has to happen at the organizational level, but I'm not powerless in that system. And I'd always felt powerless in the system before. And that's what this compassion fatigue stuff has taught me and has allowed me to do with my decision-making process. And I actually have the ability to share that with Dr. Gentry. Of course, I cried when I was sharing it, but it was so exciting for me to be able to say to him, I've only come to this point in my life because of the work that I've done through you. You know, I always thought before that I always called myself a failed teacher. I didn't last in the classroom very long. Now I know it was because I was neck deep in compassion fatigue. I didn't know that at the time. I thought I was just stupid and spent all this money on a master's degree that I didn't end up using. But now I can look at it through the lens of self-compassion and realize I actually learned some really valuable stuff as a teacher that helps me in my work with clients, that helps me when I'm doing presentations like this. And it wasn't a failed career, right? It was part of my life experience that I was able to process through. Some of that work that you can do, and I don't get paid for any of this, but Dr. Gentry's business is the Forward Facing Institute, and he works with caregivers. He's got coaching programs and a Forward Facing Me group, and you can actually process through all of this stuff with a group of folks also going through the same thing. And it's just very impactful work. So this is kind of where it starts for you, I hope. But there's a lot more digging deeper that can happen. Then you also have to develop connection and support. You have to develop and utilize a support network. Who do you know? Other professionals, other mental health clinicians that are doing similar work that you can call up and say, hey, I went to this thing on compassion fatigue, and I think I have compassion fatigue. And I want to teach you a little bit about it because I think you may have compassion fatigue too. They're probably going to get angry at you. It's okay. And I would like to teach you a little bit about what I learned and ask you, can you be part of my support system that when I'm struggling, I can go to you and I will be that person for you. I'll always ask you if you have the spoons to do that. So I won't ever just call up and trauma dump on you, but I will call you and say, man, I had a super trauma heavy day today, and I just need some time and space to be able to process. Do you have the spoons to be present with me? And I will be that person for you. So develop and utilize a support network. As we talked about, nobody gets this the way that other mental health professionals get it, right? And the last one, it's okay if you roll your eyes at me. I know that we talk to the clients that we work with all the time about how important it is for them to exercise, how important it is for them to eat well, how important it is for them to get some sleep, right? And I know I personally cringe every time I give a client the sleep hygiene speech because I know I'm not doing it. But we need to do that. There's a reason that we tell the clients that we work with to do that stuff. Think about it again from a neuroscience perspective. When you go into panic, fight, or flight mode, right? Your cortisol levels shoot up, your adrenaline gets activated. If you are in fight or flight mode, in the absence of a bear being in the room with you, right? Where's all that cortisol and adrenaline going? It's not going anywhere. It's free floating inside your body. No wonder you can't sleep. Your nervous system is fighting a bear that's not there, right? So how do you discharge that energy from your body? You exercise. You get it out through aerobic exercise. And it's a healthier way for you to kind of like get it out of your system. It's going to help you sleep better. So all those things that we tell clients we have to do too. And if you put those 5 pieces together, then you can protect yourself against the effects of compassion fatigue. I'm not saying it's never going to happen. Like I'm not in direct care anymore. When I left the mental health company, and actually when the CEO interviewed me, that was one of her big questions. She's like, are you going to be okay not doing direct care? And I was like, I think honestly, I'm ready for that kind of transition. Will I get back into direct care? Well, I have a private client right now, so I'm already back in direct care, but will I eventually get back into direct care full time? Probably. But now I know what I need to do in order to keep myself in a healthier space. However, right now as the clinical director, there's a little bit more of a buffer there for me, right? So if you put these 5 pieces together, I promise you it will positively impact your quality of life. None of this is an overnight process. Please be patient with yourself, okay? And like I said, I am not perfect at this every day. I just try to let this drive my decision-making process as much as I can, especially in situations where I'm recognizing that my fight or flight response is initiated. Because now I know what it's like when I'm tense. I can feel it happening. I have that body awareness, right? So a couple of things I want you to think about and hopefully take away with you is, what did it feel like to be in a relaxed body? I think for some of you, that's something that maybe hasn't happened in a while. And imagine having that kind of presence in a session with the clients that you work with, or with your kids, or with your romantic partner if you have one, right? And then who are you going to recruit to be part of your support system that you can process things with, who can hold you accountable if they see you developing symptoms of compassion fatigue? Because that's the other thing too. This person that you call up and ask, you're going to say to them, listen, I'm going to go down a checklist with you. And if you notice these things happening with me, I want you to call me out on it. I'm not saying I'm going to be happy about it. In fact, I'll probably be pissed at you. However, I will be this person for you if you will be this person for me. And push through my anger and defensiveness because I need you to call me out on it, right? There is a shortage of mental health professionals in this country. Now, that's been all over the news. For some reason, they didn't realize it until the pandemic, but whatever. There is especially a shortage of underrepresented communities in our field. The most recent statistic I have from the American Counseling Association is something like 35% of licensed clinicians identify under the BIPOC umbrella. There's not enough of us. There's not enough of us out there. And so my goal is that more of us are staying in this field, being sustainable in this field, and doing quality of work because you have quality of life. Because the world needs us now more than it ever did before. But I don't want you to hurt yourself in the process. Okay, so this is one of my favorite quotes. Viktor Frankl was Dr. Gentry's major inspiration for getting into all of this. He wrote Man's Search for Meaning out of his experiences in the Holocaust, as he was able to find hope even in the middle of a concentration camp. So he says that between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. And in our response lies our growth and our freedom. And I like to introduce this quote to clients at the very beginning, because what I tell them is my job here is to help you find that space. Right now, it doesn't feel like that space exists, but I promise you it does. And if you can find it, it's really going to help change your life. Okay. There's my contact information. Feel free to send me any follow-up questions or connect with me on LinkedIn. And I've given us 10 minutes for questions if anybody has any.
Thank you so much. I have a question, but I can hold it for a second. Any questions from anyone else?
No? Okay.
Okay. So at the risk of putting you on the spot a little bit, right? Like thinking back towards kind of talking about, I really liked when you said, your integrity is worth more than your reputation. And as someone who's also overseeing clinicians, both administratively and from, a clinical standpoint as well, in clinical supervision, and in an agency setting, any advice on how do we balance the need to be somewhat demand driven in that setting, just with the nature of billing and insurance and all of the things that keep overhead, with the desire to help our providers avoid being in that constant fight or flight mode, and really make sure that we're helping to align not only our own values, but their values, alongside kind of the underlying necessity that comes with those settings?
That's a great question. So I think for me, had I known this stuff when I was working in community mental health, number one, I would have spent more of my days in a regulated body, and that would have helped me stay in community mental health longer. What I didn't know at the time is that I was spending most of my day in a body that was in fight or flight mode. And so it was no wonder that I was exhausted and irritable all the time. So I think because again, I didn't learn this stuff in grad school. None of the physicians or nurses or educators or veterinarians that I've worked with have ever been taught anything about compassion fatigue. So I think even knowing it, recognizing it, talking about it, learning these self-regulation skills is key. And I actually have, I'm going to text her later and tell her I reference this. I have a friend in a situation right now where she is in an administrative position and she also does direct care. The agency that she works for is making some decisions that she is not okay with because they are not aligned with her integrity. She happened to go through that cohort with me, so she knows very intimately what I'm talking about when I'm talking about this. And we actually had a Zoom a couple weeks ago to process through. And the conclusion that she came to is, for a multitude of reasons, she's not in a position to be able to leave her job. I don't want to disclose those. And so it was, I'm going to try my damnedest to regulate my way through my days. And also, I'm going to stay where I am only for as long as I absolutely need to, because I'm going to be focusing on what my next step is. So there's not like a perfect answer. And I've had nurses in that position too, where the administration of the hospital that they were working for was not making the greatest of decisions. And they recognized, like, hey, now that we've talked about all this stuff, this is not aligned with my integrity. This is not why I got into being a nurse, but I can't leave the hospital where I'm at. Right. And so it was, okay, well, how long do you have to stay there? And can you use this stuff to make the decision about what your next step is going to be, knowing that that may not happen for another year because you're, in this particular nurse's case, it was like a student loan, repayment or forgiveness thing. And so that helped sustain her for the next year. Was it the best year of her life? No. But it did help her give at least a little bit more power to herself rather than feeling I'm stuck and I'm powerless in this situation. That just sends you down the drain, and makes you feel even worse about it. So not a perfect answer, I don't think.
No,
But
very helpful. Very helpful.
that would be my feedback. I would have stayed in community mental health longer had I known about this stuff. I would not have stayed forever, but I would have been able to stay longer.
Absolutely.
Any other questions, comments, thoughts? Okay. I'm going to stop sharing.
Yeah, and I know
there are a couple of links I want to pop in for you folks.
Please do. And while you're pulling those up, I just want to brag a little bit as well on you. But if you guys liked what you heard, right, Natasha does lots of other trainings on compassion fatigue. And so for those, if you're watching the recording as well, you've got her contact information. Please make sure that you are reaching out if you would like to talk to her about hosting a training for your needs. And there's also a really amazing event coming up May 3rd that Natasha is presenting at. It's called Clinician Fest. I just looked, it looks like you can still register online. So I will put that link in the chat box as well. It's a 2-day virtual event. I didn't even know about it. So now I'm going to find myself down the rabbit hole today of looking at all of the wonderful clinicians that are presenting. So lots of great things. And Natasha, if you want to share a little bit about the links you posted as
Sure.
well.
So the first one that I shared I talked too much today, so I didn't get to share it. But the first one is a video from Dr. Dietz, and I referenced him at the beginning because he co-wrote this book with Dr. Gentry, and it's him talking about his experience of using this stuff as an emergency room physician and having like a room full of patients that he needs to see. and being able to use these skills in order to be sustainable. The second one is Jenny Brackman. Jenny Brackman co-founded the Forward Facing Institute with Dr. Gentry. She is an adoptive parent who adopted children with extensive histories of trauma, and she used these things in order to be a more effective parent. So she's not a clinician, and she explains all of this through her lens of how this changed her approach as a mother. And then the third one is Dr. Gentry's YouTube channel. One of the things I appreciate most about him is he tries to make things as accessible as he possibly can. And so he's got videos that you can watch out there for free. I think they're well worth watching. I've sent them to, I don't even know how many people at this point over the years. But if you have the time or if you're looking for further resources, that's definitely another thing that I would recommend. And now that we've gone through this cohort, there are other folks like myself who have been trained in Dr. Gentry's work, who can do, coaching and who can do one-on-one work with folks that feel like they are neck deep in compassion fatigue and they don't know how to get out. So, share the message.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for all of your knowledge and sharing that with us today. The resources are wonderful. I've already got notes of how to incorporate those into our procedures here as well. But Natasha, thank you again so much for being here. Stay safe with the weather coming. Hopefully,
we've got a pretty interesting storm coming through this afternoon. Sorry, I do want to post one more thing. They interviewed me about how this work has impacted my life, and so if anybody's on the fence about it or not entirely sure, that's Emily did a great job of capturing my experiencing and putting it into an article. Because I mean it when I say that this stuff has impacted my life. So thank you everybody so much for your time. This has been my absolute pleasure. And hopefully you can go forth and be in a relaxed body, at least for some of your day.
Thank you for joining in on today's training. We look forward to having you join us again. Heart & Solutions is proud to provide CE-eligible trainings for our counseling community. This training may be eligible for continuing education credit hours through either the National Board for Certified Counselors, provider number 7376, or the Association of Play Therapy, provider number 21-645. To obtain CE hours for today's training, be sure to follow the steps in the description below.